Today we're going to talk about the age of imperialism, as you see here, roughly years 1850 to 1914. So imperialism is building empires by expanding territory and gaining colonies. So economic origins of imperialism, the Industrial Revolution, industrialized nations took part or took control of less developed nations to gain raw materials for industry, such things like cotton, coal, metals, a lot of different things, wood, all that good stuff, tar, things like that. So they would take these raw materials and make goods out of them, and then they would turn around and they would sell these manufactured goods to the colonies, to people who were running the colonies, European people from the same country, to the people who were mining the products, or cutting the products down, in other words, indigenous peoples. So they would increase their market by expanding and gaining markets overseas through colonization, but they would also sell these goods to themselves and to other civilized nations. So moving on. Political and social origins of imperialism. Nationalism definitely plays a part in this. Competition between nations, industrialized nations, will lead to the race for overseas empires to obtain more colonies overseas, equaled more wealth in your nation, equal more prestige, equaled a stronger empire. And you definitely wanted to obtain areas that were valuable in minerals or a raw material. The white man's burden goes right along with social Darwinism, and it's basically, many believe that it was the duty of civilized nations to civilize nations that were not as civilized by introducing Christianity and Western culture. This is definitely more of you see it today as more of a racist or very closed-minded view of how to go about civilizing the world. Social Darwinism plays right into the white man's burden. Many claimed it was natural for the weak to be taken over by the strong. Social Darwinism is actually Herbert Spencer come up with this. He wrote about it in his book First Principles in 1862, and he describes that it is natural selection, or he takes Darwin's theory of natural selection and he applies it to countries and ethnic groups. And so, of course, it basically gives an explanation to the rich and the wealthy as to why they are so rich and wealthy, and that is they've just evolved farther than anyone else. And so social Darwinism plays right into the white man's burden, because basically what it does is it says, okay, so we have all this wealth, we have all this power, and we need to share this to civilize other ethnic groups, other countries. So just in that itself, I hope you can kind of see that it is kind of a racist or kind of an elitist look at the world, because there are a lot of cultures that survived throughout the thousands of years that were okay with what they were doing, religiously, culturally, and everything. But these European nations see that it is their duty to westernize them and European culture. And by the way, if you did not agree to westernization as a culture, sometimes you were killed off. You were slaughtered. So here are some major imperial powers: Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, yes, the United States, and Japan. Here are some imperialized areas. That would be Africa. All but two countries fall under imperialism, and that would be Ethiopia and Liberia. Asia, when you think of Asia, think of China. Think of Southeast Asia. That would be Vietnam. That would be Laos, Cambodia. That's French Indochina. And, of course, Oceania would be Australia, New Zealand, and the surrounding islands. As you see, Africa, 1914, Ethiopia, and Liberia. Only two countries not to fall to imperialism. So here are some Indigenous civilizations in Africa. Some of them we have talked about. So just take a quick look at the map here. So during the late 1800s, Europeans began exploring the interior parts of Africa. By the late 1880s, European nations were racing to colonize all of Africa. The Berlin Conference. It's important you know this. Basically, what this does is it lays the ground rules for European nations to divide up Africa. It lays down a set of rules for them to go by. European nations will meet in Berlin, Germany, to settle arguments over African lands. European powers divided up all of Africa except for Ethiopia and Liberia and drew up new borders. You can look at these borders to this day and you can say that this is the problem of a lot of African civil wars. It's the European borders that still exist today in Africa. So you can actually go back and say the cause of a lot of Africa's civil unrest lay right here in this conference and the imperialization of Africa, because it forces a lot of people who were not traditionally friendly ethnic groups to live in the same country. And they didn't used to do that before this time. But basically, what you need to know is kind of, you need to know this lays down to ground rules, kind of like a pickup game of basketball, baseball, whatever, where you agree to some rules and you stick to them. And that's what the Berlin Conference was all about. It did not consider ethnic or language differences of any African tribes. That's what I was saying. A lot of these tribes that did not get along were forced to live in the same areas or under the same rule. Africans were not even invited to this thing. So, think about it. Does Africa need a new Berlin Conference today because of a lot of the border disputes we've talked about? Do they need to sit down and divide their countries up again today? You need to know that World War II is going to weaken European countries, definitely going to weaken colonization and imperialism, and this is exactly what FDR wanted to do. He wanted to kill imperialism at the end of World War II. We go after it. That's one of the things we do in the Atlantic Charter. African independence movements were able to gain strength, and during the 50s and 60s, many new independent African nations were created. It was said at the turn of the century that the sun never set on the British Empire, and here's why. They had colonies in all 24 time zones, so the British flag would be flying in sunlight 24 hours a day. Here's our empire. We have, if you look, Puerto Rico, we get the Hawaiian Islands. We took those from the Hawaiians. American Samoa, Midway, Wake Island, the Philippines, Guam. All of these are acquisitions we make. The Spanish-American War basically is yellow journalism. You need to know that. And it's a war we fought really with false pretenses, but causes, as you see, we wanted to help Cubans win independence from Spain. The U.S. economic interests in Cuba were great. We had a lot of big business down there, so we had a very big economic interest in Cuba. The U.S. saw Spain's control of Cuba as a test of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine stated that the Americas were off limits to further European colonization. We wanted to build our own empire, and we needed the raw materials and markets to do so. And we saw Cuba, Puerto Rico, and these areas as a strategic area for our Navy. Once we built a canal, that was next on the list after the Spanish-American War. We have strong nationalism in the U.S. at this period of time, and we wanted our nation to be powerful and wealthy and competitive with European nations. So the U.S. newspapers will blame Spain for the explosion of the USS Maine, which was false, completely false. We found out later that the USS Maine probably was blown up by people. We had sailors not paying attention to boilers, and the boilers would explode, and that was a common thing. We knew that back then, or we didn't know that back then, but we'll find out definitely definitive evidence in 1976. So the newspaper blamed Spain. Spain had nothing to do with this. The effects, basically, we go to war with them. We lay out 6 terms for Spain to follow. Spain followed all 6 terms, and we still declared war on them anyway. The U.S. quickly defeated Spain and became a world power. We acquired Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam. The U.S. temporarily occupied Cuba until 1903, when we made Cuba a protectorate with the Platt Amendment, which you'll learn a little bit more about in U.S. history. And there we're going to intervene in Cuban affairs for the next 57 years until Castro in 1959. We set up a military government. Cuba and the Philippines eventually gained independence. Cuba in 1903, I believe the Philippines after World War II. So the Roosevelt Corollary and the Monroe Doctrine. We declared that the U.S. was a police power of the Western Hemisphere under the Roosevelt Corollary, and we could step in when we needed to establish the peace and tranquility of the area we needed to. We established economic imperialism throughout Latin America. We're going to go out controlling people a little bit differently than European powers per se. We do have land. We do conquer some land after the Spanish-American War, but we're going to look at controlling people more economically than land. That, you could argue, still exists to this day. Panama. We offered Colombia. Panama was a province of Colombia. We offered them, I believe, $10 million to buy Panama. Colombia refused, so we basically started a revolution against Panama, or a revolution against Colombia. We funded Panamanian nationalists and funded a war against Colombia. We had 2 battleships off the coast of Panama, and we did not allow the Colombians to step in and reinforce their military. And so, of course, the Panamanian Revolution won. And part of the deal was, because there's always a string attached when the U.S. helps you, part of the deal is we get that 10-mile canal zone, which we held until 2000, and we built the canal. And that will connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which was one of the goals of our that was one of our imperialist aims, one of the goals we had. It splits time between Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, as you can see here. And there's a picture of the locks. You see the canal there. Okay. So the Japanese Empire. We're going to move on through this. Japanese opened up since the 1600s. The Japanese have practiced a policy of isolationism, which cut itself off from the outside world. However, with the Treaty of Kanagawa, the United States Navy forces Japan to open its ports to trade, and basically parts of this treaty, or how we got this treaty done, was Commodore Matthew Perry with his Navy was sent over from the U.S. by President Pierce, and his orders were basically to open up trade with Japan, and if Japan refused to open up trade, we were to start a war with them, kill off all of their leadership, their shoguns, until we found a shogun to sign this treaty, and then we would trade with Japan. So when this was posed to the shogun at first refused this treaty, but then when Commodore Perry said, well, we're going to start a war and do this, they signed it. So they were forced to open up trade, but that changes their history because they will not be a victim of imperialism. They will be an imperialist power, which will lead them, of course, to World War II. They have a modernized economy and military. They all were in awe of our Navy each time they saw it, so they built a Navy based on ours. Japan built factories, and they needed raw materials to make these manufactured goods. They quickly built a modern Navy to protect these assets overseas. So we'll talk about China in part 2.